Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming out to the talk. And my name's Colin Peacock, and I'm here as sort of a host organizing and helping Guy get around town, things like that. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about sort of my relationship with him and who he is. But before I do that, I'm also going to pass around this sign-in list. If you want to add your name and email, this is going to be a way for Juneau people to keep in touch, to get updated about events that are similar to this. And if you want to talk or further this discussion anyway, I'm just going to pass this around. Please add your name and your email if you want to do that. So about 13 years ago, I was at the University of Arizona studying conservation biology, and Guy was my professor. And he was a really interesting person. He was talking about abrupt climate change and how it was going to affect, the desert in that case in our community. And we were like, well, we want to learn more about how that's going to affect all of us living there. So we ended up putting together an honors class with mostly undergrad students, just studying what was happening in the Southwest, how it would be affected by climate change, how could we have civilization, community, with these really, really intense effects affecting the world. So that was a really pivotal time for me, and it got me interested in always examining the land that I lived in a context of things are going to change dramatically. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to prepare? What does that look like? So moving to Southeast Alaska, I now work in food security work and try to essentially start small food businesses, support composting, do lots of things regionally. And that work is really kind of linked to this idea that, if we're affected by climate change, if the barges aren't coming up regularly, if the price in oil and gas is fluctuating highly, how do we put ourselves in a place where we're more secure? So that's one of the things I take from his work, but also more just sort of philosophically. I think a lot about, what is happening to humanity, what is happening in the world. I don't know. Guy gives you a lot of real facts to deal with and things to think about. So that's one of the reasons I really value having him here today. And he's a professor emeritus at the University of Arizona, and now he lectures around the world, mostly on the subjects you're going to hear about today. And yeah, he has a great podcast and website at guymcpherson.net. .com, sorry. And what else? I also want to thank Alice Smoker, who's another host for Breadline B&B, which is her Airbnb, if anybody wants to look at that or recommend that. It's a great thing. And also thank Cache Garrett, who's another host and organizer up at University of Fairbanks. So without further ado, Guy, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Colin. And thank you all for coming. Thanks to my partner, Pauline, who's behind the camera back there. People ask me sometimes if I'm disappointed by the turnout. I've had as few as, let me think, one. Yes, an audience of one. And I point out that it isn't just about the people in the room, although I appreciate you, I really do. It's also about the few thousand or few tens of thousands of people who might see the video that will pop up at my website within the next week or so. Thank you all for coming. Thanks especially to Colin and to Cache Garrett, who grew up in Juneau but is going to school at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she's the one who reached out and started this tour. I don't even want to say what I'm going to say. I want to be clear about this. This is the worst news that I could possibly give. If I'm the medical doctor, you're the patient with a terminal diagnosis. And I can't imagine a rational, decent medical doctor wants to give that diagnosis, ever. And yet, it's something that he or she feels obligated to do, obligated by their profession. And I feel the same way. So it's not as if I take great pleasure in telling you the information I'm about to share with you. And it's a real money loser and a real bummer. Like, I used to have friends, and that was so great. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about Planetary Hospice. I'm going to talk about how we act individually and collectively in the face of the worst existential news you can possibly imagine. We face an existential threat with abrupt, irreversible climate change. Abrupt, irreversible climate change is underway. How do we act in light of that information? Stephen Jenkinson, a Canadian who has been part of what he calls the death trade for his entire adult life, has some wisdom to offer. He's been the subject of a couple of documentary films and has written a couple or 3 books on the topic, including a book that I strongly recommend called Die Wise. Jenkins points out that the great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things as they are. And I agree, obviously. Grief is required to proceed. And I would argue that grief recovery is necessary to proceed. I want to look at a definition here, the definition of hope. Almost everybody in this culture, including me, was brought up with the idea that hope is unimpeachably good. Hope is unquestionably something that we must retain. Hope was the last thing in Pandora's box. And yet, if we look at the definition, as I'm inclined to do as a writer and speaker, we see that hope is to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen or to be true. It's a desire. It's a wish. It very frequently negates action. If people believe in a favorable future, they tend to not take action. Think about hope and fear, and I'm not a fan of either one. But during World War II, a lot of people in this country were not particularly hopeful. Instead, they feared the worst. And it was that fear that motivated the Manhattan Project. It was that fear that motivated radical action, including people growing 50% of the food in the United States in their yards. It was fear that drove action, not hope. Hope, or the belief in a positive future, actually negates action, discourages action. I turn to the Grief Recovery Institute for my definition of grief, wishing for a different past. So you can see some similarities here. Wishing, hoping, wishing for a future that might or might not come, as opposed to wishing for a different past. Grief is what happens when we don't complete a relationship. For example, you had somebody important in your life die or disappear for one reason or another. You were unable to complete that relationship. Why do you experience grief? Because you didn't complete the relationship, because you didn't have the time to say the things you wanted to say. You didn't get to say, I love you, before the person died or left your life. You're wishing for a different past. That's where that grief comes from. If you fully completed that relationship, if you knew the person was going to die or disappear from your life, and you had the opportunity to meet with that person, you were able to complete that relationship. You were able to tell them the things you needed to say before you parted ways. So hope and grief are very similar to each other. Hope, the belief, this is from the refereed journal literature in a paper that has already come out. As with much of the peer-reviewed literature, the papers actually appear before the date they are given. So this is from a paper that just came out within the last week. The belief in a positive future, or hope, is not useful when presenting a person with a terminal diagnosis. And paradoxically, medical doctors, with the support of the medical ethicist community, used to do this all the time. In the 1960s through the early 1970s, it was common practice for medical practitioners to tell their patients lies, because hope was deemed more important than the truth. I'm not going to tell the patient, as the medical doctor, I'm not going to tell the patient they're going to die because it will remove hope for them. You can't do that today. That's malpractice. You have to tell the full truth to the patient. To the extent you understand the diagnosis, you must share that with the patient. That's only been within the last 50 years that's become common practice. Look at what's going on in the climate science community. Look at what's going on in the media. Look what's going on with the governments of the world. Are any of those organizations telling people the full truth about climate science? No. Have you ever heard the term abrupt, irreversible climate change before tonight? Probably not. And yet that's what we are in the midst of right now. So It seems to me that hospice is an effective way to deal with end-of-life care for individuals, and planetary hospice is a strategy for dealing with the near-term demise of Homo sapiens. I should point out that I might be biased. The author of this paper is me. So what I'm going to talk about with you today, and hopefully trigger a conversation that will continue after I'm gone, are topics such as anticipatory grief at scale. I want you to complete your relationships, including with the earth that supports us all. And when I talk about scale, when I think about scale, I'm thinking about 9/11. I'm thinking about the loss of thousands of people. I'm thinking about Nazi Germany in World War II. I'm thinking about a massive loss of life, including entire demographies of individuals. I'm thinking about the genocide that has been carried out in the United States since its founding. And not just with respect to people, but with respect to those that have no voice, the non-human animals throughout the continent, disappearing at an astonishing rate. What are the characteristics of hospice? Among them are things like honesty. When somebody is dying, they almost never are going to lie to you. There's no point. How do we scale up palliative end-of-life care at the level of the individual to 7.7 billion people or more? I don't know. These are questions I have for you. These are questions I have for everybody. How do we deal with the mess we're in that is certain to get worse? If you see something, do you say something? If you know, do you tell people? And that brings up the next slide and an important topic. If you don't want to know that there's an asteroid coming, it's going to strike Earth, and we know exactly when. The scientific community has measured that sucker, and we know where it's going to hit and when. If you don't want to know that, please, I encourage you to leave. If you don't want to know that the future is short, then this probably isn't the room for you tonight. There's no shame here. There's no blame if you leave. I certainly wouldn't blame you. I don't like to hear myself speak. I don't like what I say. It's a terrible thing. My point to this is I encourage you to leave at any time. If this is just more than you paid for. Did we sell tickets at the door? Okay. Then please, there's no shame in leaving at any time. We do know, however, that there have been mass extinction events on planet Earth. Within the last 500 million years, there have been 5 previous mass extinction events. They all had a name: the end Ordovician, the late Devonian, the end Permian, which ended the Permian period, and so on. Notice that the end Permian, 252 million years ago, is the worst of them. It resulted from abrupt heating. With some of them, we don't even know what the cause was. We think the late Devonian was a result of abrupt cooling, but it's not completely clear because we weren't around keeping records 375 million years ago. And had we been around 375 million years ago, I doubt we would have survived that. We're now in the 6th, which has gone by various names. The Holocene extinction, or the in Pleistocene extinction. It comes by a variety of names. Sometimes it's called the Anthropocene. But in any event, there is little doubt at this point that we are in the midst of the 6th. Despite that, despite books written over the course of the last 2 decades by scientists writing for the general public and by journalists writing for the general public, despite the fact that we've known for at least a decade and a half that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, this demonstrates how conservative the peer-reviewed journal literature is. It took until 2015 for a paper to appear in the peer-reviewed journal literature admitting that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. That paper, senior authored by Gerardo Ceballos in Science Advances, has an completely incomprehensible title, Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses. Only an academic could write like that. And what he really means, entering the sixth mass extinction. And he's quoted at the time in an interview that transpired coincidental with the paper coming out. Life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on. And there's a paper that just came out today in the peer-reviewed literature indicating that we can put a number on this now. It's about 10 million years for the planet to recover. So for those of you thinking you're going to persist in a bunker with your canned peaches and your sterilized water supply, you're in for a really long wait. Finally, in a follow-up paper, Ceballos and colleagues used the title Biological Annihilation, a term I never thought I would see in the peer-reviewed journal literature. These are conservative people writing for conservative outlets, and they don't use terms like annihilation. This is not the National Enquirer. This is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Biological annihilation. And the second author on that paper, Paul Ehrlich, says in the interview, coincident with the paper coming out, we're toxifying the planet. You can't create a toxic world and expect to survive. I want to talk briefly about a wide variety of topics, so I'll try to hit each of them with sufficient depth that you understand what I'm talking about, but not go into so much detail that you're falling asleep in your seats. Maybe I'm too late for that. It looks good so far. So I want to talk about functional extinction. Functional extinction is when a species loses habitat, but there are still individuals alive. Habitat is the place where an animal or a plant typically grows and lives, and even reproduces. And without habitat, no species persists very long. We are currently at the highest global average temperature on Earth with Homo sapiens present. A year ago, we were just about 1 3/4 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, when the global average temperature of the planet was about 13.5 degrees Celsius. And that was a year ago, and it has only warmed up since then. For example, functional extinction, a relatively well-known example, the white rhino. There are 2 white rhinos remaining at a conservancy in Kenya. They're both females. This is a conservancy worker consoling the last male rhino on the planet as it died, as he died. And now there are only females left. That's functional extinction. We don't know when the last individual will go extinct, but the species is functionally extinct. Despite the 2-degree lie that you've heard repeatedly, that we need to hold the temperature at 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, we've known since October of 1990, when the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases pointed that 1 degree Celsius was the absolute upper limit. The language here is important. Beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses, in other words, exponential change, that could lead to, and this is important, extensive ecosystem damage. The United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases knew that it was important to maintain ecosystem function, because without properly functioning ecosystems, we don't survive. We depend upon those ecosystems, and Alaskans surely know this better than almost anybody else in the United States, because you're actually close to the land. You know where your water comes from, and it's not through the tap. You know where your food comes from, and it's not from the grocery store. And most Americans don't have the slightest idea about either one of those. I'm going to point to 7 different means by which we could experience functional extinction. I'm not going to give a prediction about when extinction will occur, when the last individual will die, because, it could be that the last individual is surrounded by the bodies of like-minded sociopaths in a bunker on a dead planet. I don't want that to be me, but that's the kind of thing that could happen. We don't know whether that's going to be 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 20 years after functional extinction. But I don't know about you, but for me, once we get to the point of functional extinction, within the midst of the sixth mass extinction, and I know we're headed for essentially a dead planet, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in being in that bunker. Now this is kind of interesting because once I was. I left active service at the University of Arizona on May 1st of 2009 and went and established a platinum-grade homestead in the wilds of New Mexico, right next to the Gila Wilderness area. And I had the bunker. And I had 6 tons of food stored in the bunker. And I had 2 solar pumps and a hand pump. And I was going to live forever. And then over time, it became obvious we were in the midst of abrupt climate change. Over time, it became obvious we were in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. And you put those two together, and I realized a dead planet is not for me. So I left the 2.7 acre homestead behind and the bunker to go with it. One of the 7 means I'll briefly describe that by which we could go functionally extinct is a 50 gigaton burst of methane that was described by Natalia Shukova and her colleagues at the European Geophysical Union meetings in 2008, when they wrote in the abstract the release of up to 50 gigatons of hydrate, which is methane, in the relatively shallow sea floor of the Arctic Ocean, is highly possible for abrupt release at any time, and they indicated that that would warm the planet by about 1.3 degrees C. And it's the rate of change that's important here. That methane comes out, and within a year, the entire planet is warmed 1.3 C. We're now at 1.75 roughly degrees C above the 1750 baseline. We can only imagine what a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise in the span of a year would do. There's no way for a tree to keep up with that. The planting zones by the USDA just moved thousands of miles in a year. So the rate of change is critically important. This causes functional extinction when or if it occurs. This notion was broadly criticized by modelers, most notably Gavin Schmidt, who took over James Hansen's job as the leading climate scientist for the United States government, and also by other modelers, notably including one at the University of Chicago, who disparaged Shukova and her research team. But the referee journal literature, which is very conservative, came out with papers over the course of the last couple of years strongly solidifying the notion that we can expect a very rapid release of methane in a short period of time. These are very conservative outlets. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Nature Communications, Cryosphere Discussions, these are conservative outlets. So to support the idea that this kind of release is possible is earth-shattering. In addition, there's the permafrost. You're all familiar with it here. There's the terrestrial permafrost, not just the former terrestrial permafrost that is now buried under the Arctic Ocean because of sea level rise coming out of the last ice age. And methane released from terrestrial permafrost in a recent paper in Geosciences was measured up to 8,500 parts per million. Typically, methane is measured in parts per billion. This is in parts per million. In other words, this is 8.5 million parts per billion. This is huge. Methane is more than 100 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is, molecule for molecule. So this is an enormous release of methane being emitted from the permamelt that we used to call permafrost, and it's going on right now. We know of no way to stop this. Continued industrial activity will continue to warm the planet. Tim Garrett is the chair of the Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Utah, and he pointed out in a paper published about 10 years ago that civilization is a heat engine. And this is from the press release that came out coincident with the paper in November of 2009. And it says here, Garrett treats civilization like a heat engine. He now denies saying that because he's been McPhersoned. I go around quoting him all the time, so now he says I never said that. But he clearly did. In addition, this paper was so terrifying when it was published by Climatic Change in November 2009 that there was tremendous scientific outcry and the paper was pulled from publication. It was finally published in February of 2011, 14 months later, by a very brave editor named Stephen Schneider, who was on his deathbed. And still, it was only published because it was accompanied by 2 responses from research groups that took issue with the findings. Interestingly, they didn't put forth any evidence to refute the findings. And interestingly and unusually for the academic literature, Garrett was not allowed to respond to those 2 commentaries. So that's how terrifying this information is, that civilization itself is a heat engine. And what Garrett finds is that it doesn't matter how we power this set of living arrangements that we call civilization, whether it's wind turbines or solar panels or wave power or fossil fuels, it's a heat engine. It heats up the planet no matter what we do. And think about where solar panels come from anyway. Rare earths and a lot of oil and coal to power the digging up, the extraction, the refining, and the building of those solar panels. So these are not substitutes. Renewable energy sources are not substitutes. They're derivatives of fossil fuels. Item 4 that could lead to functional extinction is, oddly enough, decreased industrial activity. If increased industrial activity causes increased heating of the planet, then decreased industrial activity causes heating of the planet even faster. That's a bummer. This is this paradox between increasing and decreasing industrial activity, both causing abrupt heating of the planet, has been called the McPherson paradox because I point it out so frequently. Decreased industrial activity because of something called aerosols in the atmosphere. If we stop burning fossil fuels, by burning fossil fuels, we not only put greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that trap heat and hold it close to the planet, we also, through burning fossil fuels, create aerosols, most notably sulfates, that go into the upper atmosphere and act as an umbrella to keep the light from getting in. In fact, as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity causes a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise, and this transpires at somewhere between 5 days, in an interview with James Hansen, to about 6 weeks, which seems to be the general consensus among other climate scientists. So a very short period of time, much shorter than a growing season. So again, this very rapid change could well cause functional extinction. And a recent paper in Science concludes that the aerosol masking effect has been greatly underestimated. So it might be that even a less reduction, a lower reduction in industrial activity would cause a rapid global average temperature rise. With some of these things we just won't know. It's like trying to identify the extinction date for the last human being. Nobody's going to know, nobody's going to write it down, there's nobody to report to anyway. One example, and it seems to me we're long overdue for such a reset, is a financial collapse leading to economic collapse and therefore a reduction in industrial activity. So this is what this looks like. We know that global warming in a general sense, or what is frequently referred to as global climate change, but it is warming of the planet, is caused by carbon dioxide and water vapor and methane and 40 other greenhouse gases. And at the same time that industrial activity produces those components that warm the planet, it's also producing the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming. And it's primarily the sulfates in the atmosphere that are bouncing the incoming radiation off of the planet. And these are the ones that fall out quickly when we stop burning. So we stop burning coal, for example. These fall out of the sky within 5 days to 6 weeks. Whereas these ones, take carbon dioxide, for example, the heating associated with carbon dioxide will last at least 1,000 years. So we're on the wrong end of both of these things. Item number 5 in the list of 7 is a decline in grain harvest. According to a paper in Soil Systems from June of last year, the decline in earthworms is over 80% in tilled areas compared to untilled areas, looking at a planetary basis. Some places it's 100%, some places it's only 50% loss of earthworms. But you lose 50% of the earthworms, that's not really amenable to producing healthy soil or maintaining healthy soil. That decline in grain harvest might come from the land hurricanes that are all the rage in discussions about the Midwestern United States now. But this paper came out of NPR in 2012. 7 years ago, we recognized some of the outcomes of abrupt climate change. Now we're reading about more than 30% loss of the grain crop this year because most of the farmers in the Midwest had the grain stored in silos and they've consequently gone underwater. And that's no way to store grains. Item 6 is an ice-free Arctic projected to occur by Maslowski and colleagues in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. Well, it didn't happen in 2013 or 2014 or 2015 or 2016 or 2017 or 2018, so I'd say we dodged 6 bullets so far. Will we dodge one this year? Again? Don't know. It's not looking promising. If you look at the Arctic sea ice extent shown here, and this is from less than a week ago, and the current extent is considerably below the average, which is this grayish, pinkish line. I'm chromatically challenged, I have no idea what color it is, and 2 standard deviations on either side of it. So we're looking at a very low ice extent and volume right now. The president of Finland described in a joint press conference with President Trump in August of 2017, he summarized the scientific literature on the topic by indicating if we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. And in fact, in the absence of Arctic ice, we could very well experience a 6 degrees Celsius global average temperature rise within a year or two. And that is astonishing, and keep that in mind for a few minutes, that 6 degree global average temperature rise. Finally, there's the El Nino currently underway. El Nino events are characterized by a release of heating from the ocean. The ocean is like a battery. It stores carbon dioxide and it stores heat. And during El Nino events, a lot of that heat and a lot of that carbon dioxide comes out of the ocean. And so this is the 1997-98 El Nino, the biggest one ever recorded. And this is the date that many climate deniers point to and say that the planet hasn't warmed at all in the last 20 years. Look, it's the same as it was then, which is classic cherry picking. Picking this year to represent the average. So if it's a severe, moderate to severe El Nino, we could have sufficient heating to take us beyond some threshold at which we can't produce grains at scale. I'm not saying that will happen. In fact, there's a question mark behind this one, unlike the others. I'm certain that the others, given sufficient time, could well cause loss of habitat. I'm not certain that this El Nino event will be strong enough to cause worldwide loss of habitat for our favorite species, Homo sapiens. So there's a list of 7 distinct paths to functional extinction by which humans could lose habitat at the global level in a relatively short period of time. And we don't know when that will be. It'd be nice if we knew. You know, if we knew the date that functional extinction was going to occur for humans on planet Earth, it would be a lot easier for us to live, wouldn't it? We know how much money we needed to tell them. We need to know how many peaches to store, got the whole thing down. But we don't know. It's like with your own life. You don't know your own expiration date. It'd be great if you did. It'd save you a lot of trouble. There's a lot of things that I just wouldn't do if I knew I was going to die tomorrow. Like, I hate cutting my toenails. It's like the worst thing ever. It's a long ways down there. Are you kidding me? And my eyes aren't as good as they used to be, so I'm constantly hitting my toes. I'd just say fuck it to the whole toe clipping thing if I knew I was going to die tomorrow. There's other things too. So what we're talking about here is exponential change. And we are very poorly evolved to deal with exponential change. So I'm going to show just a little tiny video clip that illustrates exponential change or the exponential function.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino, which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
Think about that, 29 steps from something that if I was holding it up here, you could just barely see it, to the Empire State Building. That's a great example of the exponential function, or what I typically call the excremental function, because it's really a shitty deal. A paper which came out in Scientific Reports last November, November 13th to be exact, by a couple of authors, both of them biologists, called Co-Extinctions Annihilate Planetary Life. That's one of 2 papers, to my knowledge, in the peer-reviewed journal literature that has the word annihilate in it. I mentioned the other one previously. Annihilate planetary life, all of it. All of it. So they indicated that we do not need the catastrophic meltdown of the world's 450 nuclear power plants to cause the loss of all life on Earth. We only need a 5 or 6 degree global average temperature rise. And as I indicated previously, an ice-free Arctic, which seems likely to occur this year or next year or maybe the year after that, is sufficient to cause up to a 6 degree global average temperature rise in a very short period of time. Now they go on in this paper, interestingly enough, they go on to say, we don't think it could actually happen. Our results indicate that it does happen, but it's almost as if they were experiencing cognitive dissonance. They couldn't quite agree with the finding that their research pointed to because it's too much to take in. And it is. It's a lot to take in. And I don't think it will happen, certainly not quickly after a 5 or 6 degree global average temperature rise. I don't think that there are microbes that live 7 miles below the surface of the Earth. 7 miles. And we can't kill them in a few years. Try as we might. I don't think we're going to get them. Eventually, maybe, but I don't think that's 5 years or 10 years or 27 years from now. I think we're a long time out from that. And so maybe I'm experiencing the same sort of cognitive dissonance that the authors are experiencing, for that matter. And so again, as reported in the corporate media, risks an extinction effect that could annihilate all life on Earth. And they're talking here about what they call the domino effect, which is perfect given the dominoes presented in that short little video clip. And the lead author points out that even the most tolerant species, so we might think of ourselves as very clever and very tolerant to environmental change, After all, we can live in the Arctic, we can live in the Antarctic, we can live on the International Space Station, we can live in nuclear submarines under the sea. We appear to be very adaptable in terms of a species, but even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. Of course we depend upon the living planet. Of course we can live in a nuclear submarine for a while. Of course we can live on the International Space Station for a while, but where does the food come from? It comes from here, from the Earth, from the ecosystems present on this planet. I'm going to go through a thought experiment with you. Imagine that you're in a paradise, like say, I don't know, Juneau, Alaska, and you're looking off your deck, and the radio's playing, and it's 9:30 in the morning, and you're having your first cup of coffee, or tea if you're like me. And by tea I mean carrier for honey. So you're having your first cup of hot honey, and then suddenly you see it. You gotta love my Photoshop skills. Suddenly the mushroom cloud appears, and you know what that means. You know there's no escape. A nuclear bomb has just gone off, and it's right there in front of you. And then, equally suddenly, a 20-foot metal I-beam is spinning through the air again. Classic Photoshop here. Spinning through the air, and you're paralyzed, and you realize it's going to come right at your head. It's going to take your head off in the next 3 seconds. Nothing you can do. And then, miraculously, it flies over your head. The voice comes on the radio. It says that nuclear detonation is 3 minutes from us. So the shock wave will hit in 3 minutes. And you're like, I thought I had 3 seconds. Suddenly, you have 3 minutes. Suddenly, you have the ability to write a few notes, to scribble something for somebody who might survive you. Suddenly, you have enough time to call somebody you love on the telephone. 3 seconds was nothing. 3 minutes is nothing. In the grand scheme of things, you suffered through far longer than that right here tonight. But 3 minutes compared to 3 seconds, it's almost forever. Rinse and repeat a few times, and take yourself up to 3 weeks. Say you're at a doctor, a medical doctor, and the medical doctor gives you a diagnosis of 3 weeks. We've done these tests, and you got 3 weeks plus or minus a day or two, and then you're going to be dead. And you think, it's horrible. And then you think back to the 3 seconds and the 3 minutes, and you think, 3 weeks. And then he goes out of the room, he conducts another test, he comes in, I'm very sorry, you actually have 3 months plus or minus 15 minutes. And if you heard that after you just heard 3 weeks, you would think 3 months is a reprieve. You were right in the firing line, and now you got an extra 2+ months. In 3 months, you can see everybody you love. You can call everybody on the phone. You can write your will so many times, cross it out and throw it away and start over again that you know your hands get tired from writing all that. If I had started this presentation with, I'm going to give you 3 years, I'm going to give you 3 years to live, that's it, you would have thought, 1, I'm insane, and don't think I haven't heard that one before. And 2, that's an incredibly short-term terminal diagnosis. 3 years is not long at all. You got so much you want to do. So do I. I'd be stunned if we have 3 years. An ice-free Arctic, projected to occur in 2016 plus or minus 3 years. If we make it another 3 years, I would be thankfully, gratefully, stunningly astonished. That would be awesome. Now I live as if I don't have 3 years, as if I don't have 3 months. Another story, if you don't mind. My partner, Pauline, is better at Photoshop than I am. This image actually includes 3 countries. The beach ocean, rocks in the background, are from New Zealand. The children are the children of the caretaker at her property in Belize in Central America, and she asked them to throw rocks into the big garden in the tropical jungle. And the starfish come from Pauline's sister's house near Orlando, Florida. So 3 countries represented in this picture, and unlike my photoshopping, you'd never know. Seems sort of natural. So this story is to remind us of the story that some of you have probably heard. There's a small boy walking along the beach, and there are thousands upon thousands of starfish washed up on the beach, and they're all going to die. And the little boy is walking along, and he picks them up one at a time and throws them out into the ocean. And a cynical old man comes along, looking a lot like me, and says, "Hey boy, you can't save them all. You're doing no good at all. What are you hoping to accomplish there? You can't solve this problem. It's too big for you. What you're doing is not worthwhile." And the little boy picks up a starfish, and he looks at the cynical old man, and he says, "I'm making a difference to this one." And he throws it into the ocean. And that's where we are. We don't know how long we have. As Homer pointed out, some 2,800 years ago in the Iliad, any moment might be our last, might be your last. Excuse me. In the paragraph before this one, Homer is explaining how the gods envy us. The gods envy us because we are doomed. Because we have to die, and therefore we get to live. The gods don't have that privilege. The gods are here forever. The gods will never know the joy of sniffing a rose and knowing that they won't be able to do that forever. The gods don't get to stop and smell the flowers. The flowers are forever, just like the gods. The gods envy us because you will never be lovelier than you are now. You will never be here again. So, in light of our collective terminal diagnosis, which none of us appreciates, certainly including me, how are we going to act? What are we going to do? What is important, given that you've known since you were 12? Since you were 12, you've known that birth is a sexually transmitted disease that is proven fatal in every case. We know this. How are you going to live? Some people are going to do this. Life is short. And who am I to tell you what to do or not to do? You want to spend all day arguing with strangers on the internet? Knock yourself out. We all find joy in different ways. I'm going to tell you what I'm doing, and I'm not going to be judgmental about what anybody else does. I used to be one of the most judgmental, terrible people on the planet. I would judge students by the papers they would write, for example. Maybe that's a bad example. I think I was born to teach. I didn't really recognize it until years later when my parents were telling me for the 9,000th time that when I came home from school in first grade at the age of 6, and I sat my poor younger sister down, she's 4.5 years old, and I'm trying to insist that she knows how to read. I just learned how to read the day before, but I expect her to know how to read already. And it seems ridiculous that I would be attempting to teach her that. So I love my life as a teacher on campus. This is a student who I last saw in Florida about a month and a half ago. And the previous time I had seen her was 18 months earlier, when she took a class from me. And in each of my so-called science courses, this one was called conservation biology, I asked my students to complete a significant piece of art or literature as a major part of their grade. 18 years later, she still had hers. we had lunch together, and she brought it with her, and she said, I still have it. Look, this is what I did, and it's so important to me. This changed my life. And she cried, and I cried, and Pauline cried, and there's just crying all over, and the sea level rose 3 feet because we were crying. So really, it's my fault. I will continue to do things like this, delivering these presentations, and thankfully I have Pauline behind the camera, so it's not only for the people in this room, although I very much appreciate you making the effort. I know more than almost anybody that your time is short. I will continue to submit to interviews. Here I'm in New Zealand and running a workshop. Pauline and I developed a workshop called the Only Love Remains Workshop that we hosted at our home in Belize a few times and continue to host elsewhere. At some point I know I will be given my last PowerPoint. Look, I photoshopped myself in. And until then, I will be dancing. And my latest book is called Only Love Remains, Dancing at the Edge of Extinction. And that reflects how I'm going to live my life, with urgency, with death in mind. Because I finally figured out that my days are short. I'm going to continue to pursue excellence in what I do. I'm going to continue to pursue love in my life. And I encourage other people to do those things as well. But I make few recommendations anymore. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it, and we can take time for a few questions and discussion here if you would like. Thank you.
Okay, I have relatives in Europe, so when I travel in Europe, I don't come across climate deniers. But here in the U.S., specifically one party seems to be full of climate deniers. So I'm wondering if you see there's a psychological difference between the U.S. and Europe as far as climate denial goes.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In my first book-length work of social criticism, published on January 1st, 2005, and called Killing the Natives, Has the American Dream Become a Nightmare?, I pointed towards the European solution post-World War II, really a collection of solutions, and how Europe structured itself with the help of the Marshall Plan, and therefore the United States, post-World War II, and compared that to the United States. And there's all this public transportation and enormously high costs for things that are costly that we were basically giving away. Eastman Kodak was the worst polluter in the world for many years because producing or transforming film into prints was just terrible in terms of pollution. And so the first time I traveled to Western Europe, I took a roll of film that cost me $2 in the United States, and I got to Europe and it's $8 for the same roll of film. They were actually pricing in the bad behavior, pricing in the cost of pollution that resulted from developing that film into prints. And the cost of gasoline was about 3 times what it was in the United States. And so they took all these steps to sort of reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. So it's a very different model. Now, of course, as a result of the aerosol masking effect and the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of the world's nuclear power facilities, it appears that we're all going to experience the same untoward outcome at approximately the same time, which I think is unfortunate, because in terms of creating a civilization, Europe far outdid the United States. And for that matter, New Zealand and the way they treat social justice issues, things like race and indigenous peoples, for example, are far superior to the way it's done here or in Europe, either one. And as it turns out, for better and for worse, everybody dies. So, the ultimate reward is that we get to live. The ultimate punishment is that we all have to die, regardless of how we acted in our individual lives. And we all know that some people are, quote, better than others with the way they treat each other. right? Some people are complete jerks, and we recognize them mostly because they're in political offices. And they still have a decent life. Like, we've had decent lives, I suspect, most of us, whether we deserve it or not. For me, it was just choosing my parents and my place and time of birth. February 29th, 1960 to James Lyle and Edna Carroll McPherson. What a deal. So I got to experience economic expansion, a relatively peaceful time in a country that created the world's most lethal killing force in planetary history. I benefited greatly from that. I didn't vote for any of that. I didn't get to choose that. So I live with gratitude every day for the life that I've had that I didn't really have much control over. The best thing of all, I was born white. How can you not beat that? That's just a great deal. Louis C.K. does this, the stand-up comic and social critic, does this great skit on being white. I'm not saying that white people are better. I'm saying being white is clearly better. Who could even argue? I have enjoyed enormous privilege in my life because of the time and place I was born. And I didn't pick any of that. And I'm grateful for it. And I look at life differently now than I did when I was 6 years old in Weep, Idaho, trying to teach my poor 4.5-year-old sister how to read. She certainly appreciates it. Yeah.
So you'd recommend that we go from wine to cognac?
Yeah, I think that's what you're hearing, yeah.
All right, that's good.
Alice?
Well, so I just want some clarification, I guess, about the ice-free Arctic, because, so you're saying that any single year, like any single annual incidence of ice-free trips some irreversible warming process.
Right.
So even just one single year, even though the following year could potentially, I mean, that's the thing that I'm having a hard time with. Is there,
Right.
I understand climate modeling to be really stochastic and whatever.
Right.
Complicated.
So, of course it depends. If we have an ice-free Arctic, and by the way, ice-free Arctic by climate scientists is defined as being less than 1 million square kilometers of ice.
Okay.
So it's not even ice-free. It's just measurably ice-free because it's hard to get every little bit of ice that's tucked away in every little cove, right? So that's why the 1 million square kilometers comes into play. And if we have an ice-free Arctic, say this year in September for one day, will it make a huge difference? Probably not. But it's a harbinger of what's to come in following years. We're headed for Cretaceous or hothouse Earth. And even, you know, if you look at the trend right now, it looks truly horrible, but that's what it looked for the last 2 summers too. So we might get off without an ice-free Arctic this year. If we have an ice-free Arctic and that ice-free Arctic comes in July, for example, and stays ice-free through September, then I have little doubt that we will experience massive crop failures the following year. But we might anyway, as a result of the land hurricane, or the drought in Australia, combined with really horrible weather in the United States and Canada and Europe. So, unfortunately, we don't know because we've never been here before. The last time the Arctic was ice-free was 3 million years ago. Humans have been here, Homo sapiens has been here for about 1/10 that time. So, because we have not experienced an ice-free Arctic, we can't explain fully what the outcome will be and when it will have great impact. But if we have an ice-free Arctic in August, I think that will be catastrophic, if not for this year, then for the following year's grain harvest. Because it'll warm up so quickly in the places where all the grain is grown, which is in the interior of large continents in the northern hemisphere. Europe, Asia, North America. So it's one of those unknown factors. Some climate scientists, like Peter Wadhams, who I respect greatly, indicate that it might be as much as 5 years, somewhere between 3 and 5 years after the first ice-free Arctic, before all systems fail catastrophically. I can't imagine it would take that long. I think that's wishful thinking, but I'm completely on board with it if it goes that way.
Well, that's the first ice-free Arctic and followed by subsequent years of ice.
Right, right. And it could be, you know, if we barely have an ice-free Arctic, which seems unlikely at this point, if we barely have an ice-free Arctic this year, then it could refreeze completely next year. It would surprise me very much. Currently, where the ice is forming, and the ice is forming again right now, more than 80% of the ice that is formed never gets it out of the birthing grounds right now. So the ice that's forming isn't lasting very long. So again, it's a complex system that we don't fully understand. It's hard to say what's going to happen. But climate science is not filled with good news.
You're standing right now, 200 years ago, it used to be 100 feet high.
Right.
This whole valley was,
Right. Yeah. And Colin took us out to the Mendenhall Glacier today and pointed out where the observatory stations used to be and where they are today, and you can barely see the glacier.
we used to throw a rock.
Right, that's what he said. He said you used to go right to that little peninsula and throw a rock and you could hit the glacier. And now, you know, you damn near need binoculars to see the thing. So things are happening very quickly. We are in the
I can't stand this planet anymore.
we're in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. We're in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. How long we have, I don't know. I'm grateful for another day at this point. Yeah.
I'm trying to hang on to hope here. Is there a scenario that there could be a natural sequence of events that would stop the global warming?
I have yet to come across a climate scientist who thinks that we will slow or stop warming at this point within temporal spans relevant to the human experience in any event. So yes, at some point the planet probably is going to cool down again.
After we're gone, yeah.
So if you're going to put in a time capsule, you might indicate that 10 million years from now would be a good time to dig this up.
The planet's gonna be fine, yeah.
Yeah.
There is a slight hope. What was it, the Maunder minimum, 1615?
Right.
1715, that seemed to shift the jet stream and cause cooling in Europe when there was no sunspots.
Right.
And there is some indication the sunspot cycle is decreasing the last couple of cycles.
Yes.
So that is one element of hope, the subject you brought up.
Let me dash that hope, if you don't mind. We're at 1 3/4 above the 1750 baseline. The Maunder minimum was the most catastrophic cooling event in records, in recorded human history, and it was 0.4 degrees C. It was a cooling of 0.4 C. We're at 1 3/4 above the 1750 baseline. So I suspect, you know, that still takes us over the one that triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops, according to the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. And climate speaker and writer David Spratt indicated in November 2014 that we actually triggered those self-reinforcing feedback loops at somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 degree. And we're not going back to there anytime soon. I'm sorry. That was a terrible hope dashing thing.
I'm an optimist.
You never know.
Well, you're no Tony Robbins, I guarantee you.
Thank you for that. People are filtering out, so now would be a good time to wrap up.